Okay, thanks for joining us. As I mentioned before, my name's Kika Bradford. I was one of the researchers responsible for this study that took place in 2025 about recreation use and recreation users at Canyon Ferry Reservoir in Montana. And I'm going to present today a little bit what happened. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of who ITRR is, so Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research. Then I'm going to present the study context and the purpose, present a little bit of how we went about this study, a very brief overview of the results, and then the summary and some insights that we had. So the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research has been around since '87, and it's the research arm for Montana's tourism and recreation industry. It's funded by a portion of the revenues from the state lodging use tax, and basically our objective in tourism and recreation is to support the industry on strategic planning, marketing, policy making, and management. This is a little bit of our team, some of us who worked at Canyon Ferry in 2025, like Dr. Melissa Weddle, who is our director and was also one of the co-leads on this project. We have some ongoing research projects that takes place every year. Some of them are listed over here. The results from those projects are publicly available on dashboards. The link is right over here at the bottom of the slide, and you guys can see a little bit of the non-resident travel survey and visitation data, as well as the resident survey. We also have a tech research project that every year we go through a call for projects in the fall, like people suggest many different types of topics on projects. In 2024, Canyon Ferry was chosen to become one of these projects to take place on the fiscal year of 2025. So basically the reservoir is in around Helena and near Townsend in Montana. The last comprehensive study was done in 2003, 2004. Management decisions require credible data and updated data. And that's a little bit of what we were trying to do in a context where recreation demand has been increasing not only around Montana, but also around the country and in the world. And in particular, in Canyon Ferry, there has been a perceived increase in visitation and a lot of pressure happening in many different sites with a big focus on boat ramps. And we were trying to understand like how that's actually taking place in reality. So to mirror the past projects, we were also trying to understand and characterize the visitors and the use. So basically, who's visiting Canyon Ferry, what they're doing, how many people are going, where they're going, when they're going, and what is the pressure that visitation is happening on the infrastructure. So as I was saying, the reservoir is near major population centers, especially Helena in Montana, is managed by the Bureau of Reclamation, from where we added this map. From their maps, and it's a large multi-access system with boat ramps, campgrounds, day use areas. There are many activities taking place and users. There's a lot of pressure and competing interests around Canyon Ferry. There's also a little bit of understanding of how the study took place, and basically although we wanted to be everywhere and all the time, there's a capacity limitation. So we chose to focus on reservoir focused sites. So we excluded sites that were not on reservoir but associated with Canyon Ferry, but they were on rivers. So basically the ones that are circled by this red circle were excluded from the study. Water-based recreation. So although we know there's a little bit of hunting that takes place around the reservoir, that was not the focus of our research. In areas that's managed by the BOR and accessible by land. So to talk a little bit about how we went about to collect data, we had a lot of efforts were done to survey the visitors, like through an intercept. Basically, we approached visitors while they were in their recreation, either site or like joining the activity, and invited them to answer a few questions, and then invited them to take home and complete a follow-up survey. We also had a lot of counting, like basically counting the recreation use and users around the reservoir. And we did this through traffic counters, one trail counter, systematic observations on campgrounds, on parking lots, and on boat ramps specifically. And we also had secondary data from reservation.gov campgrounds. So to achieve representativeness, because we couldn't be everywhere all the time, we split the reservoir into a spatial sampling. Like, so we included in our sample not only those sites that we just mentioned in the inclusion criteria, but also high and low use areas. We included sites that were exclusively shoreline access, boat ramps, campgrounds, marinas, and we were very careful not to oversample by focusing on highly popular sites like the Silos Recreation Area. Our temporal sampling, like we were basically around from February through October 2025. Unfortunately, we had to cancel our field trips in January and November due to extreme weather conditions. And then December, we just deployed not deployed, we removed everything from the field also because of low visitation and poor weather. But during that time, we focused on both weekdays and weekends, mostly on Thursday through Monday, and from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with a few days like earlier in the day or later in the evening. And in order to achieve this representativeness, we were very careful to think about all of these and be very intentional about how we were collecting data. So a very brief snapshot, and although it's brief, it's also a little bit long. I'll try to be very straight to the point. And the big picture that I want you guys to pay attention is that Canyon Ferry, from our understanding from the findings we saw, is like a Montana-based and repeat use visitation, short duration visits. People are usually interested in doing multiple activities at the same times, and there are very predictable patterns. So to start about like who visits Canyon Ferry, our sample was basically young and male and well educated. The average of adults were 48-year-olds, like 62% were perceived male. 42% had at least a bachelor's degree, and 50% makes $100,000 and up of income on a yearly income. Visitation comes from mainly people from Montana. 73% of the people we talked to were Montanans, basically from primarily from Lewis and Clark, Gallatin, and Broadwater counties. They're composed of small groups, so less than 3 people as an average group size. 45% of the respondents were family-based groups, And 11% of those people declared that there was at least one person with a disability within their group. There's a lot of repeat visitation on Canyon Ferry, like about 90% is repeat visitors, and an average of 12 visits in the past 365 days, so in the past year. To talk a little bit about the visit patterns, the visit duration, 61% of those who we intercepted were spending the night. The majority were spending 2 to 3 nights, like which overlaps with a weekend trip. 39% were day users, and among those, 54% were up to 4 hours, so somewhat short visits. The frequency per year, these are the two top categories. So most people visit between 5 to 11 times a year, but there's a lot of people who visit over 20 times a year. And a lot of people would say, "Oh, I come here every weekend," or "Oh, I just live nearby." And one curious pattern we identified is that most people do not move. They stay put in their visit. So they usually stay like 80 to 95% of the people, they stay wherever we intercepted them. So for example, if we were talking to them on Goose Bay, they would not move to Hellgate or Confederate, the majority. The most popular area, as expected from a lot of conversations that we had from people who have a lot of experience in the area, is Silos Recreation Area with 37% dedicated visitation. So this is a breakdown of the visited areas. The use is concentrated. As we can see, about 37% of people were visiting Silos, 14% Hellgate, 13% Goose, about 12% Court Sheriff, and everything else is below 10%. So we can see that there's just a few sites that take the majority of the visitation around Canyon Ferry. And at Silos, for our research purpose, we broke it down into 3 different areas. So the marina, that's where the big ramp is, that big parking lot, the campground, and the south end. So we can see here on a map, like the south end, and the north end, which is pretty much day use visitation around Silos. And like among these 3 areas, the marina saw a lot more people than the campground and the southern end. And then the least popular among the 3 of them was the north end. So when does visit occur? We basically, it's very predictable. I'm not going to say anything like very out of the box. Seasonal peaks, like they increase through spring, they peak in July and decline after August. So very concentrated. Friday to Sunday saw the majority of the use. For example, 55 to almost 70% of campground reservations from recreation.gov was from Friday to Sunday. The peaks during the days are midday and late afternoons, and holiday peaks were the majority, especially Memorial Day. The boat ramp use, about 50% of the intercepted people said that they were going to use the boat ramps. 58% of those people launch and retrieve once per day, and 98% put in and take out at the same ramp. So again, predictable patterns that it's somewhat simpler to manage. We also try to understand the boat ramp use by observing use and counting the use on that. And what we saw was very low congestion. There was no lines at all in most boat ramps in 93% of the scans. And when there were lines, they were very short, 2, 3 cars, sometimes 5 or 6, usually associated with an event like a tournament at Silos. And these, like as we can see here, Silos again is the most popular boat ramp, then goes to Goose Bay Marina, Shannon, and then Hellgate. So from traffic counter data that we're operating from March through December 2025, we can see the peaks that we were talking about as far as time wise. It keeps growing during the spring. It peaks in July and then it comes down onto the end of the year. We can see the majority of the people coming for Silos. Then Shannon is the second most most used area where we had traffic counters. Then Confederate and Duck and Hellgate, depending on the year, they were kind of like on third place over there. And Confederate and Duck, each one of them had a counter, but because you could enter through one end and exit through the other, we combined for analysis to make it more meaningful. And these numbers are extrapolating number of visitors by multiplying the number of vehicles with the number of people per vehicle that also came from systematic observations on the ground. So from reservation.gov data, what we can see again is this pattern that like from May through July, it's increasing visitation with a peak in July, then slightly coming down in August and September. And we did not have access to concessionaire data, so this is just campground use. The campgrounds that are dispersed campsites, even though like it's BOR managed, like it's not included here, only the ones that could be reserved through reservation.gov. And what we can see is that Court Sheriff is peaking on almost all the, well, not almost, like in every single month of the year of the peak season when it's operating, like mostly followed by Joe Boner, which is a very small campsite, like with low capacity. So to further understand, as I was saying, we did a lot of systematic observation. There were 780 scans throughout the seasons. Like in 78% of those scans, we could see that people were present. So there was a consistent use presence. 22% we saw no one. Which is significant, especially in low season, not so much during summer, unless there was a big storm or something related like that. There were a lot of peak use evidence. So we saw more than 100 people in many scans. Like one example is Court Sheriff during Memorial Day weekend. There were a few instances that there were too many people to count at Silos and Goose Bay, again at Memorial Day weekend. And peak conditions were basically concentrated on weekends, holidays, and during the summer. Again, predictable, but reliable and credible data. We were also trying to understand the pressure from parking and vehicles, like in parking lots and campgrounds. In most scans, so over 90%, we could see that vehicles were present. And we can see that, like I just said, that 78% people were not present, but we could see a little bit of use through the presence of vehicles. So maybe people were in the water or in their RVs, or maybe they went on a hike, but we couldn't see them while we were doing the systematic scans. There were a few peak counts at Silos, over 160 vehicles per hour. On Goose Bay, over 140 vehicles per hour in the parking lot. And what we saw is that high use sites such as silos, show sustained occupancy during peak periods and sustained use of the parking lots and the campgrounds. So basically what we saw, where we saw the sustained pressure were at Silos, Goose Bay, and Hellgate. There were some peaks at Duck Creek and Confederate, again, Memorial Day weekend. And like at West Shore sites with very low capacity for vehicles, like due to really small parking lots, it was very low and intermittent. But what we saw, like taking into consideration what we were observing in parking areas, in campgrounds, and on boat ramps, is that parking reflects more sustained pressure than boat ramps at Canyon Ferry. As I mentioned before, like most people reported doing multiple activities on one single trip. The most popular activity is fishing of a boat or power boating. Obviously, they're connected. Camping using an RV or a different type of vehicle, and then swimming in the water. Just so you know, like camping using a tent was a separate category and it was not one of the most popular one. But as I was saying, like most people reported doing like between 3 or 4 activities per visit, which brings a lot of demand and pressure onto managing recreation at Canyon Ferry because the infrastructure is overlapping. So we try to understand a little bit of satisfaction among respondents. Visitors were highly satisfied across the board. Like the overall satisfaction on a 7-point scale was pretty much 6.5, extremely high. People were very satisfied also with visitor service provided by the BOR and the facilities they encountered. And we could see the average over here of visitor service 5.6 and facilities 5.7. And what we saw on when people were addressing like on an open-ended questions is that they have strong attachment to Canyon Ferry and they come back very often. One example or one question, actually 2 questions, we try to understand the importance that respondents attributed to many different items and with the quality, how they evaluated those items. And what we can see over here, like on the x-axis, is that the importance, several of them are not so important for people. So for example, signage or a campground environment, like if they were within sight and sound from other campsites, the maps, or the wildlife. So not so much importance. And the quality, although like it was slow, if we think about like under a management perception, because like the importance is so low, like this is a low priority. We can see over here that like people scored really high on many different items as well, but they also evaluated the conditions of these items extremely high. So it looks like the BOR and the people managing like concessionaires and others are putting or should keep up the good work in areas like picnic areas, boat ramp, restrooms, and campsite conditions, for example. The only one that was scored really high on importance, but also scored really low on quality was crowding or the perception around crowding. So let's talk a little bit about it. The majority of the people reported actually low to moderate crowding, an average of 2.8 on a 7-point scale. Very few people relocated due to crowding, about 10%. The majority of the people who experienced crowding reported that they experienced that on parking lots and campgrounds mostly related to silos and Chinamans. And crowding, therefore, is localized and situational. But crowding is also very controversial. Like that, it was once the report is out, you can see that there will be a little bit of inconsistency on responses. Sometimes they show very low to moderate crowding perception. Sometimes on open-ended responses, they say that it was too crowded. Sometimes they also measure solitude really high. So it's kind of interesting that it was very inconsistent. So to summarize a little bit, what we can understand from all these results and the findings is that Canyon Ferry is operating as a local recreation system dominated by repeat visitors and residents of Montana. The majority of the visits are short, and people tend to stay within a single recreation area per visit. Recreation is multi-activity with visitors combining boating, fishing, camping, and use is predictable and patterned, driven by weekends, peak season, and consistent use behavior. The majority of the use is concentrated in a few sites, especially silos and Goose Bay. Parking areas and campgrounds show more pressure than boat ramps. The peak congestion is driven by weekends, holidays, and midsummer months, so it's not throughout the year. And observation data shows that there's short and intense peaks and not constant crowding in the majority of the time across the sites that we were studying. So what does pressure actually look like? Memorial Day weekend, so we could see a lot of people in a very short period of time that we were scanning, a lot of vehicles in the majority of the access points. Saturdays are very busy, but yet there's not crowding perception of the surveyors and observers most of the times. And there's actually many low use periods across most sites. So high use moments are intense, but short-lived and predictable. So therefore, like in our perception, the challenges that is driving management of BOR recreation sites is basically spatial concentration and like in a very short period of time. This multiple activities overlap and not necessarily the total visitation growth. It's just like this very high concentration of use. So to think about a little bit of implications for management, and suggestions is to focus on high use nodes and manage peak periods, especially Memorial Day and 4th of July. Plan for multi-use interaction, which can lead to conflict, which has not been the case among the respondents. Maintain local access. It's a very dear place for the majority of the respondents. And target infrastructure in these few specific nodes, not system-wide expansion. Before we end and open up for questions, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Bureau of Reclamation, especially the people from the Canyon Ferry Field Office and Outdoor Recreation Planning Office, the members of the Citizen Action Group for the silos, who helped and provided a lot of input into the study, concessionaires, camp hosts, and everyone who supported field effort and provided valuable insights. If you guys want to subscribe to the ITRR newsletter, you can use this QR code that we're going to drop on the chat, the link to subscribe to this newsletter and receive updates and on latest research, reports, and etc.